25 years of Israel's independence were a golden period, years in which nothing of importance seemed to go wrong. Independence. The first sovereign Jewish government for 2,000 years. Victory in war. Admission to the United Nations. A huge and successful mass immigration. But then, for 3 years after 1953, nothing seemed to go right. Israel came down from the heights to a period of uncertainty, anguish, and confusion.
This fall from grace was symbolized, perhaps even accelerated, by the departure one after the other of three men who symbolized the golden years. In November 1952, the first president, Chaim Weizmann, died.
Israel's great friend, President Truman, was leaving office. So a second reassuring and familiar face was leaving the scene.
And then there was another departure, more sudden, more unexpected. The first prime minister, the leader of our society, David Ben-Gurion, resigned his office.
Ben-Gurion came to live in his retirement in Sde Boker, a small settlement in the Negev desert. The captains and the kings depart. Israel would now live in a different region and in a different world. He continued to receive all the heads of government and representatives and party leaders at Sde Boker, leaving his successor, Moshe Sharet, without any real authority. This greatly increased the sense of uncertainty and of tension that characterized the next few years. The British at that time still had their troops in Egypt guarding the Suez Canal. The Israelis saw the British as a welcome buffer between them and the Egyptians. But in 1954, a dramatic change took place.
In London's House of Commons, Prime Minister Churchill wins a vote of confidence on his decision to withdraw 80,000 British troops from the Suez Canal zone in Egypt. After 72 years of occupying this vital waterway, with land and air bases built at a cost of over $1 billion, Britain will evacuate in 2 years.
So to the dismay of many Israelis, President Nasser, Egypt's new leader, had persuaded the British to leave. The relations between the three Israeli leaders, Moshe Sharet, David Ben-Gurion, and the defense minister Pinchas Lavon, became tense and confused. Our Defense Department conceived the idea of inciting one of our intelligence groups to blow up installations, embassies,
even cinemas in Cairo, in the hope that Nasser would be blamed by the United States and Britain, and we would therefore bring about alienation between him and the West. It was an absurd, sterile action, and it was to have catastrophic results on the Israeli domestic scene. The conspirators were caught, imprisoned, and in two tragic cases, hanged. After this disaster, Lavon resigned and Ben-Gurion ended his retirement and returned to government. For the next few months, Ben-Gurion served under Moshe Sharet as defense minister. The nation was once again confused about who was running the country. And in November 1955, Ben-Gurion resumed the office of prime minister. Once again, there was a strong hand at the helm. In those years, Israel faced grave problems. Our borders were long and difficult to defend. Our neighbors were hostile. We felt besieged. There was a sense of choking solitude. Before 1948, a Palestinian Jew could travel to any of the neighboring countries. Afterward, and to this day, the railway lines all end at the international frontier. We lived in our own hermetically sealed world.
The Gulf of Aqaba, or Eilat, runs from the tip of the Negev into the Red Sea, but at the narrow Straits of Tiran at its entrance, Egypt had built gun emplacements and thus prevented Israel from using that route. The Suez Canal had also been closed, not only to Israeli ships, but also to foreign ships sailing to Israel with other flags ever since 1948. In 1954, when an Israeli freighter attempted to test the blockade, the Egyptians confiscated its cargo and jailed its crew.
They were cutting us off from 2/3 of the world by blockading us illegally in the Suez Canal and in the Straits of Tiran at Aqaba. And for all this, they were not even opposed or even criticized.
Our relations with the Soviet Union since 1947 had been cooperative, since our common purpose was the end of British rule. By the 1950s, this had been achieved. The Soviet Union now made a bid for Arab support in the Cold War.
President Eisenhower did not cancel or weaken any of President Truman's formal commitments about recognition and statehood and our place in the international community. He even increased our economic aid.
During my 9 years as ambassador to the United States, I had many dealings with the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. Nobody doubted his ability and his experience, but he combined the articulation of high moral principles with a reputation for deviousness. His problem was not that he had enemies, but that his friends were not very fond of him. From the very beginning, Dulles devoted much effort to build up the Western position in the Middle East. He visited Egypt, bearing friendly words and gifts, including a revolver, for General Naguib, the leader of the military junta which had expelled King Farouk and seized power a year before. The British Prime Minister Anthony Eden, as well as the Americans, was making an intense diplomatic effort to win the heart of the Arab world. Secretary Dulles' purpose was to curb Russian influence by a series of Western defense and arms agreements which would block Soviet penetration. By 1955, a whole network of mutual security agreements was in place. Israel was excluded from all of them. Desperate, isolated, our country faced an enormous security problem. Our borders could be easily penetrated at many points. Soon, gangs of professional terrorists, sponsored and trained by Arab governments, broke into Israel day by day. Terrorist infiltration and murder became a routine. This was Israel's principal agony. Israel responded to terrorism by reprisal raids and attacks on terrorist bases.
But the purpose was actually to force the Arab countries to take measures to stop the infiltration from their side.
General Moshe Dayan, now our chief of staff, established a special unit under the command of Major Arik Sharon to carry out Israel's retaliatory operations. In October 1953, a young mother and her 2 children were murdered near Lod Airport. In retaliation, Sharon's forces raided the Jordanian village of Kibbia. It was a disastrous action. 66 Arabs were killed, including many women and children. The world's reaction was unprecedentedly severe. Many Israelis were shocked by Kibbia. It was decided to take great care in the future to avoid civilian targets. Nevertheless, the United Nations Security Council, on one occasion after another, condemned Israel's responses while ignoring Arab provocations.
Well, we couldn't put up with this. No other state has ever put up with such conduct from its neighbors. All the other nations in our region had two things which Israel lacked. They had alliances and they had sources of arms. Now, Israel had neither of these two things. It had no assurance of alliance and of support, and it had no sources of arms. You cannot begin to understand what subsequently happened in Israel unless you bear in mind this choking sense of desperation and solitude.
Gamal Abdel Nasser, who had succeeded Naguib as president of Egypt, was Israel's most implacable enemy. His frankly proclaimed goal was to destroy Israel, thus avenging the defeat of 1948 and restoring Arab pride and Egyptian supremacy. In the summer of 1955, a high-ranking Soviet emissary arrived in Cairo. A deal was struck. Russian weapons now via Czechoslovakia in return for future supplies of Egyptian cotton. Who were these new weapons to be used against, asked the Israelis, if not us? On hearing of the arms deal, I took immediate action.
I had to try to get assurance of American arms supply. But the very next day, it was quite evident to me that the response of the United States was cool. Even when I presented a final request in October, President Eisenhower and Secretary Dulles made it very plain to me that they had no intention whatever of matching the Russian arms and especially the jet aircraft that were soon to be pouring into Egypt. Instead of arms, what I got from the United States was advice: rely upon world opinion. Put your trust in the United Nations, or more ominously, if Egypt really worries you by its pressure, why not give them something? Why not appease them? How about a chunk of the Negev?
The idea that Israel should sacrifice large parts of the Negev was hair-raising. Israel felt embattled and alone. There seemed to be no way out.
We did find a way out, a difficult, complex, somewhat fantastic way out. For the first and only time in our history, we found common cause with other nations.
Nasser was making enemies all over the world, far beyond Israel. The Suez Canal, owned by the British and the French, was seen in Egypt as a symbol of foreign imperialism. When the United States and Britain refused to finance Nasser's favorite project, the Aswan Dam, he ordered his forces to seize the canal. He said, "It is our canal now. We are the main shareholders." Nasser returned to Cairo a hero, applauded throughout the entire Arab world. The British were enraged. They prepared to take military action.
But this I must make plain. We cannot agree that an act of plunder which threatens the livelihood of many nations should be allowed to succeed.
The French were encouraged and surprised by Eden's militant attitude. France also depended on the canal for its oil supplies and felt exaggeratedly that its economy was now at Nasser's mercy. Throughout the summer of 1956, the British and French drew closer together and more distance from the United States. Prime Minister Guy Mollet of France visited London. And now began the great split with Washington.
Well, I'm not going to comment on the actions of any other government. For ourselves, we are determined to exhaust every possible, every feasible method of peaceful settlement, and we believe it can be done.
Secretary Dulles deeply disliked Nasser's policies, but he was not prepared to support the use of force against Egypt.
Secretary Dulles said to me, sanctimoniously of course, we can't meet violence with violence.
I said to him innocently, well, Mr. Secretary, with what can you meet violence except with violence? In his desire to prevent Britain and France from making war, Dulles inspired a conference in London of all the powers who used the canal. He put together complicated schemes to retain international control over the canal without offending Nasser. Anthony Eden recalled his golden days of the 1930s and transmitted his experience to a new generation.
With dictators, you always have to pay a higher price later on, for their appetite grows with feeding.
The French government believed, with some exaggeration, that but for Nasser, France's troubles in rebellious Algeria would be surmounted. Nasser was providing the Algerian nationalists with valuable military material and moral support. It was this consideration, in the autumn of 1955, that induced the French to supply Israel with modern jet airplanes. Israel had an ally at last. We'd never had such an experience before. There was exultation in Israel when, in the spring of 1956, some French jet aircraft with their new trained Israeli pilots arrived at an Israeli airfield. Very reluctantly, the British, who had often been our adversaries, were moving ever closer toward us. There was still intense mutual suspicion, but in our determined resistance to Nasser, our two nations had found an overriding common interest. On October the 22nd, while I was in Israel, Ben-Gurion took me aside to reveal an extraordinary plan. With his chief of staff, Moshe Dayan, and with Shimon Peres, his deputy defense minister, he was about to embark on a historic mission. A flight to France in a French plane. They spent 3 days of secret meetings with the French, who were later joined by the British Foreign Secretary, Selwyn Lloyd. At the small town of Sèvres near Paris, the three governments sealed and signed a plan to thwart Nasser. Ben-Gurion had been reluctant to cooperate with the Anglo-French scheme, but his strong prejudices against Britain were overcome when Foreign Minister Selwyn Lloyd promised to use British air power against Nasser. Shimon Peres recalls the joint scheme.
Ben-Gurion was afraid that if the British will remain free, disengaged, they may take the Arab side, because he didn't trust the British. So the British were brought in. The French convinced them. They saw in Nasser a repetition in a small way of the Hitler-like system. I remember Gimolet telling me that he was always afraid of the expressions pan-Germans, pan-Slavs, pan-Arabs.
In the early evening of October the 29th, Israeli forces moved into Egypt. The Sinai campaign had begun. Dayan's opening move was to drop a parachute battalion deep inside Sinai, 40 miles from the Suez Canal. The paratroopers were instructed to take no action because this was primarily a political move designed to create intimidation. However, they were ambushed by the Egyptians, and Sharon's parachutists suffered great losses.
Let's not forget that we took a risk. We went to fight before the French and before the British.
It could be called the War of the 100 Hours. It was fought by the Israeli forces with intelligence and valor. an Israeli brigade forced its way over almost impossible territory to achieve our principal goal, the capture of Sharm el-Sheikh. The British and French governments had issued an ultimatum to Egypt and Israel for each to withdraw to a distance of 10 miles from the Suez Canal. But since we were much more than 10 miles distant from the Suez Canal already, this withdrawal process was an absurdity. Egypt rejected the Anglo-French ultimatum and refused to withdraw. Nobody in the world believed the British and French claim that they were merely trying to protect the Suez Canal by separating the combatants. The plain truth was that each of the three was protecting its own national interests. Sharm el-Sheikh, overlooking the Straits of Tiran, was captured. Egypt's blockade had been lifted, and the Egyptian guns which covered the straits were rendered useless. The main purpose for which Israel had fought this war was now fulfilled. Israeli commanders were ordered to kill as few Egyptians as possible, but to capture or destroy as many tanks and guns as they were able to capture. When the full scope and implications of the British, French, and Israeli operations became evident, there was pandemonium in the world community.
North France had the right to use arms against Egypt because they were...
It was the most tense and feverish international moment since the end of the Second World War. The world was in shock. Here were two Western Atlantic states invading Egypt in defiance of the policy and will of the United States.
I am ever more deeply convinced that the United Nations represents the soundest hope for peace in the world. There can be no peace without law. And there can be no law if we were to invoke one code of international conduct for those who oppose us and another for our friends.
Israeli troops were now deep into Sinai. The Soviet Union was making threatening noises. I found myself the target of deep international suspicion and antagonism. My task was to explain that whatever the motives of the British and the French, Israel did have a special case. Our security, and our security alone, was at hazard. It was late at night. The United Nations General Assembly was in session. Tens of millions of people had glued their ears and their eyes to the television screens.
Embattled, blockade besieged, Israel alone amongst the nations faces the battle for its security anew with every rising dawn and with every approaching nightfall. We know that Israel is most popular when it does not hit back, and world opinion is profoundly important to us. So on one occasion after another, we have buried our dead, tended our wounded, clenched our teeth in suppressed resentment, and hope that this very moderation will deter a repetition of the offense, that sometimes the right and duty of self-preservation prevails in the final and reluctant decision.
Here is the paradox of the United Nations. Having applauded this speech with such enthusiastic vigor, the General Assembly went on to vote against us by something like 69-3. The United Nations ordered Britain, France, and Israel to stop their military actions. Dag Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General, had even threatened to resign. The double standards were running riot. No American or international sanctions or restraints were imposed on the Soviet Union, which was brutally engaged at that very moment in suppressing the national revolt in Hungary. The Soviets shot the Hungarians and then cynically condemned Britain, France, and Israel for what they called aggression against Egypt. The events in Hungary complicated President Eisenhower's position. So did the fact that he was at the climax of his re-election campaign. His vice president at the time, Richard Nixon, recalls,
under the circumstances, if it had not been an election year, and if we had not had the situation in in Budapest and Hungary, I don't think there's any question but that we would have supported what the British and the French and the Israelis were doing in their own interest.
The United States exercised severe financial pressure on its wartime ally Britain. It insisted on an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. The Anglo-French operation was over almost as soon as it had begun. Britain and France abandoned their Suez adventure. It was their last appearance as great powers in history. We in Israel were not prepared to follow the British and French example and to move out unconditionally. On my recommendation, the Israeli government decided to withdraw from all of Sinai except Sharm el-Sheikh and Gaza, and to struggle hard for two objectives: free passage in the Straits and a UN force in Gaza to prevent terrorist actions against Israel. My Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, didn't make things much easier for me. When he made an extraordinary speech on November the 7th, he said that Israel would never give up an inch of the territory that it had captured in Sinai, that we would not allow a single non-Israeli soldier, including an international force, to set foot in that area.
That the Sharm el-Sheikh area had once been part of a Hebrew kingdom in ancient times, according to a Greek historian of whom nobody had heard. Well, Ben-Gurion did have some moments in which emotion overcame lucidity, but they were always brief. It was quite obvious that he would not be able to maintain that position against great power and international pressure. I gave a strong hint of our policy in a speech to the United Nations General Assembly.
There is a method of withdrawal which might make a renewal of the conflict almost inevitable. There are methods of withdrawal which would make a renewal of conflict or acts of war almost unthinkable. We therefore naturally advocate the second method, and we are ready to discuss ways of giving effect to that preference. This connection,
for the first time, I felt that we were receiving a sympathetic hearing. Gaza, which Israeli forces had occupied in the Sinai campaign, had been the source of too many terrorist attacks to be restored to Egypt lightly. I also felt that we could exchange Sharm el-Sheikh for a real certainty that Egypt's illegal blockade would be annulled and free passage for Israel would be assured in the Straits of Tiran.
The delegation of Israel is ready at any time. Thank you, sir.
This was the theme that I developed through both of our embassies over the next 4 intense and crucial months. I was greatly assisted by the Senate leaders, especially Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, who told President Eisenhower that he would kill his budget if the United States administration continued, as he put it, to persecute Israel. Moreover, another option had opened through the statesmanship of Lester Mike Pearson, the Canadian Foreign Minister. He proposed to create an entirely new dimension of international responsibility. He proposed the establishment of a United Nations peacekeeping force, whose first task would be to proceed to the Straits of Tiran.
The real breakthrough came on February the 11th, 1957, when I was handed a historic memorandum from Secretary of State Dulles. The Gulf of Aqaba comprehends international waters, it said. No nation has the right to prevent free and innocent passage there. Gaza had been a source of armed infiltration, it said. A United Nations emergency force should move into the area to be on the border between Israel and Gaza. So we had won the 2 issues for which we had gone to war. And so in the spring of 1957, the United Nations forces finally arrived, led by the Canadian General Burns. The Dulles Memorandum had also promised that a United Nations force would be sent to Sharm el-Sheikh to guarantee freedom of navigation in the Straits of Tiran. And And now it was time for our troops to go. Israeli forces could begin their return journey through Sinai with their banners flying high. In April 1957, an American oil tanker arrived in Eilat. Dulles had promised me to send an American ship through the straits, and here it was, an unromantic symbol of Israel's political victory, the opening of the seas to Israel, the establishment for the first time of Israel's maritime contact with East Africa and the Persian Gulf and Asia far beyond. The Suez Affair had totally different results for Britain and France on the one hand and Israel on the other. The British and French came away from Suez empty-handed, humiliated, and with their position in the world irreversibly changed and diminished. This failure was the cause of Anthony Eden's downfall. The Suez Affair proved that Britain was no longer the dominating actor in the world's diplomacy and strategy. France, more ambitious, transcended its defeat by looking for a hero. It restored Charles de Gaulle, who set his country's policy on an independent course. De Gaulle had learned that when it came to the crunch, he could not trust Americans with French interests.
It destroyed, and this was one of the fallouts that was particularly bad, it destroyed the willingness of the British and the French to play a significant role in that area, or for example in the whole Gulf area, because we held them back, and therefore they could not play that role, and we had to assume the sole responsibility for playing the role. So under the circumstances, President Eisenhower, years later, in the mid-60s, when I talked to him about it, said, yes, on reflection, it was a bad decision.
Well, there was some justice in this contrast because Britain and France on the one hand and Israel on the other operated on totally different levels of justification. In 1960, as president of the Weizmann Institute, I organized the first Rehovot conference. It brought hundreds of political leaders from the developing countries together with distinguished scientists from all over the world. Many people, including our first foreign minister, Moshe Sharet, thought that our association with the British and French imperialists would mean that we would lose our position in the Third World. But the opposite happened. For the first 12 years of its existence, only one head of state, U Nu of Burma, had visited Israel. 4 heads of state from the Third World came to the Rehovot conference. We were breaking the diplomatic boycott. Water is the key to Israel's existence. The national water carrier was a great engineering monument in a period of engineering monuments. This huge and imaginative scheme transported water from where it abounds in the north to where it was needed elsewhere. It was only one of many great achievements. Another was the oil pipeline laid from newly opened Eilat all the way from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean coast, so that the world's dependence on the Suez Canal would now be reduced. There was also an enormous expansion of house building. The 10 years after Sinai was a time when Israelis, to the distress of some, would behave as normally or as absurdly as other nations. There was peace, only relative peace to be sure, but enough to give Israel its most tranquil decade. Now at last the immigrants were coming again in large and steady numbers. Israel was engaged in its main purpose once more. There was a florescence of culture. Modern Israel was defining itself.
Here
Archaeology in that decade became something of a national obsession. It was as if, in exploring the relics of their ancient past, Israelis were seeking a meaning for their renewed presence in the land. They were to find that meaning not in the distant, but in the all too recent past. Adolf Eichmann had been the monstrously efficient administrator charged by Hitler with the extermination of European Jewry. One morning in May, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion told me that he wanted me to fly in an Israeli aircraft to Buenos Aires to celebrate Argentina's anniversary of independence. The aircraft would bring back Adolf Eichmann, who had been captured there by Israeli agents. The plane returned with Adolf Eichmann unwillingly aboard. He was brought to trial in Jerusalem and charged in the name of 6 million silent Holocaust victims. The trial was carried by television and radio throughout the world, but it was in no sense a show trial. It adhered to the highest and most somber principles of justice. The Supreme Court Justice Gabriel Bach was then an assistant prosecutor at the trial.
I'll never forget the first moment of that trial. Then this felt not only just, but right and appropriate. And to me, suddenly the meaning and the impact of the creation of the State of Israel became more real and more clear than anything that I'd experienced before.
Im Sinne der Anklage nicht schuldig.
Day after day, witness after witness recounted the facts, often distraught, sometimes overcome by the burden of reliving their experiences. The effect of their evidence on those who heard it was profound, sometimes disturbing.
There was one moment where I came near breaking point. That was when I questioned in court a witness from Hungary, a person who was lured by a very devilish scheme of Eichmann to board one of the trains to Auschwitz, believing that he was coming to a summerside resort.
We got off the train. The Germans ordered men to the right, boys 14 years old, also white, women, girls, and little children to the left. I was standing there with my son when the women disappeared to the left. A smart-looking German officer in uniform came over and asked me, "How old is your son?" I told him my boy was just 12 years old. He asked, "Where is his mom?" "Run to your mommy." As the boy ran, I was wondering, how could he possibly find his mother among so many women? My daughter wore a bright red overcoat, and when I looked up, I could still see a tiny red spot fading away into the distance, a reassuring sign that my wife was also there. As I turned to the right, the red spot grew smaller and smaller. I never saw them again.
Now, by chance, I had bought my little daughter of 2.5 years, was 2.5 years old, a little red coat about 2 weeks before that. So when I heard that, and I heard it for the first time together with the other people there in the courtroom, I was completely struck dumb. I couldn't utter a word. I couldn't frame another question.
For Israelis, the Eichmann trial was a sacred drama. It had a purpose transcending even that of historic justice. It threw the very sharpest light on the significance and necessity of Jewish statehood in Israel, and on the importance of defending it. Ben-Gurion was not a man who tamely followed public opinion. In spite of its unpopularity, he pursued a policy of reconciliation with Germany.
A history-making conference in New York City finds Israel's Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion and West Germany's Chancellor Konrad Adenauer in a talk to discover grounds to reconcile their peoples.
Adenauer needed Israel's approval, which could alone give him international legitimacy. Ben-Gurion needed German economic support, which would help Israel to survive, and Israel's survival was, after all, history's decisive answer to Hitlerism.
My people cannot forget its past, but we remember the past not in order to brood upon it, but in order that it shall never occur again. I said in the Knesset, this is in Hebrew, the Israel Parliament, last summer, that Germany of today is not the Germany of yesterday. After having met the Chancellor, I am sure that that judgment was correct.
The whole question of relations with post-war Germany touched the deepest chords of feeling in Israel. Many Israelis wanted nothing to do with Germany, certainly not diplomatic relations, which did not then exist. When the West German Defense Minister Franz Josef Strauss visited Israel in 1962, he was cordially welcomed by Peres and Dayan for the government, but not by large sections of the public. Menachem Begin condemned all contacts with Germany as an abomination. Some Germans were behaving in a way that lent weight to this argument. It was known that German scientists, though without their government's approval, were helping Egypt with a rocket program. In 1960, Ben-Gurion went down to the Negev to watch the army exercises there. Not many people then realized that a flow of weaponry, including planes, had been finding its way to Israel from Germany. Ben-Gurion, with his inflexible commitment to Israel's security, had no doubt about the need of accepting these arms. But it was a furtive episode in Israel's history. The Germans wanted to keep the business secret for fear of provoking the Arabs. And when in 1965 the secret became known, they immediately caved in and stopped the supply. They sought to compensate Israel in the diplomatic field. Dr. Kurt Birnbach, the personal representative of the German Chancellor Erhard, arrived in Israel. I, as Deputy Prime Minister, was asked by Levi Eshkol and Golda Meir to negotiate the terms of a German-Israeli accord. We reached agreement, and the task of presenting that agreement to the Knesset fell to me. Feeling in the country was running high. But the great theme that we had learned from Ben-Gurion, and which I now pressed home, that the decisive refutation of Hitler was continued Jewish security, won the day. On August the 19th, 1965, the first German ambassador, Dr. Rolf Paulus, presented his credentials. In the streets, passion and memory were doing their work. By this time,
Ben-Gurion was in his final and real retirement in Sde Boker. He was honored by the visits of dignitaries from all over the world. Konrad Adenauer, himself now in retirement, was one of them. The old men greeted each other with feeling. A bitter chapter in the history of their two peoples, although never to be forgotten, was closed. Levi Eshkol, Ben-Gurion's successor, was populist, practical, and down-to-earth. Very much a man of peace, Eshkol was the principal architect of the Israeli economy. He was destined to guide Israel's fortunes during the most dangerous of times. Not that life seemed dangerous in the spring of 1967, all the evidence suggested that there was no imminent danger of war.
On the 5th of May, 1967, I had received an intelligence report couched in words of the most emphatic complacency, saying that there was no early danger of any substantial risk of war. President Nasser's troops were bogged down in a military adventure, which he had inspired himself in Yemen. The report told us that the Arab world was torn by contentious divisions and that it had no capacity for common action.
Throughout the 1960s, we had constant trouble with our Syrian neighbors. The shelling of our agricultural settlements from the Golan Heights had become as routine as were the measures that we had adopted to deal with it. Armored tractors sometimes encroached into the demilitarized zone which officially separated our two countries. Artillery exchanges were common. In April 1967, there was an air clash with the Syrians. Our French planes did a great deal better than Syria's Russian planes, shooting down 6 MiG fighters. It was the victory of Israeli pilots over Syrian pilots. Syria constantly provoked Israel by terrorism, but did not wish to face Israeli retaliation. It appealed to Cairo in simple words: help us, live up to your alliance.
The Soviet Union was informing Syria that Israel planned to capture Damascus in a surprise attack. The Soviet Union was telling Egypt that it ought to rally to Syria's defense. In this campaign of falsehood and malevolence, the Soviet Union was forging the first link in a deadly chain.
The May 1967 Independence Parade in Jerusalem was a very low-key affair. None of Israel's formidable weaponry was on display. We were deliberately signaling our peaceful intentions to the Arab world.
While I was watching the parade in a tranquil mood, a military messenger approached and handed a small piece of paper to Prime Minister Eshkol, to our Chief of Staff Rabin, and to me, with a very brief message saying, well, you ought to know that the latest news from Egypt is that large contingents of Egyptian troops have poured into Sinai, and there is talk that they are soon going to ask for the removal of the United Nations emergency force.
On Israel's Independence Day, the Egyptians declared a state of emergency, held a parade in Cairo, sent 2 armored divisions into Sinai. 2 days later, Nasser called for the complete withdrawal of the United Nations forces in Sinai. Would Nasser try again to impose the blockade on the Gulf of Aqaba, which we had fought so hard to lift in 1956? If Nasser were to close those waters again, war would be more than probable. It would be certain.